Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about the way that people's fighting styles adapt based on the armour they're wearing. Now, as you can tell, I don't actually have a decent helmet like a bassinet or a Salatin Bevel and the rest, so I'm using this birthday or Christmas present I got instead, which is just a woolen hat, but I hope you like it, and it gives at least a visual idea of some of the things that we're talking about. So, this was inspired by the fact that someone had on my Discord server had shared a video which was of the famous, infamous group called the Holmgang, who are in Germany, and they often fight, these sort of sparring similar to what we do in the rest of Europe with historical European martial arts, looking at the old treatises and how knights, men-at-arms and the rest fought, but they tend to do it in a less safe fashion. Now, of course, some of us in Britain say, there's too much health and safety and whatnot. I think these guys take the idea of taking the safety net away a little bit too much. However, they are a fascinating study when they injure each other and cause horrible disfiguration. So, what was interesting, was based on how they spar, you can notice distinct differences between there and in places like the club that I go to, for example, because we use things like let's say we've got steel swords like this and a shield. The sort of equipment I'd wear would be a fencing mask to cover my head. I'd wear a gambeson to protect my torso, which can protect against impacts quite a bit, suffice it to say, but also has cut resistance, and indeed the modern jackets are even Newton rated against puncturing and piercing through cuts and things like that. It also have similar sorts of things on the legs, maybe some greaves, things like that, and of course some very sturdy protection on the hands. And most especially focusing on the head, for obvious reasons, so much can go wrong if your head gets injured, and also your hands, because they're the most vulnerable parts, which can sacrifice manoeuvrability when you're using things like the Spez gauntlets. Now contrast with areas, people like the Holmgang, and from what I see they might sometimes wear some sort of gloves that look a bit like gardening gloves and things, and they'd also wear some sort of facial protection, ranging from, if you're looking at stuff like their sabre, they just seem to wear a sort of face mask, and if they're doing sort of more medieval, like your early medieval up to late medieval or Renaissance fighting, they'd have maybe a shield, usually a Saxon Viking style round shield, and some sort of arming sword, with their armour being, they'd have a proper helmet with aventail and things like that. And like I say, there's those gloves. So the way that they fight actually seems to get quite determined by that, because bearing in mind they fight with sometimes less safe weapons and sometimes, so I hear, even sharp weapons. It means that they often fight in a way like I've seen in certain street fights. Like I saw this one particular street fight between a person with I think it was a machete and one person with a stick, and they are very much fighting. They were starting their fight very much out of measure, and they were performing a lot of cuts. I mean, they weren't doing any thrusts because none of their weapons were useful for that, but they were doing a lot of cuts, and they were doing it very much out of measure. Now, when people like me talk about out of measure, that's basically, let's say I'm trying to cut the camera off its stand. Why did I fail? I'm too far away. That's out of measure, just to get that out of the way. So, they're doing a lot of this sort of gesturing and movements and things, and there is almost a guarantee that they won't hit, on a lot of those swings, unless the person foolishly closes the distance during that time of the attack. But yet, it seems that because of the fact that the weapons are so dangerous, it causes people to be cautious. So they're still performing these sorts of attacking movements and doing those sorts of things, even though there's almost a guarantee that it won't actually do any harm, and repeatedly do this, maybe to wear an opponent's defences down, maybe because they want to do a real attack, but they just can't, they can't find the courage and the initiative to actually close into a proper range where it would have a real effect. I mean, the exact reasons why are up to interpretation, but you compare it to things like what we do over here in HEMA, and the very noticeable, the elephant in the room when it comes to what happens in here, is the fact that people can end up being a bit suicidal. It's not quite as extreme as things like your sport fencing, where people pretty much lunge onto each other's blades, but there are a lot of what we call afterblows, which is where you've been hit, and then you're hitting the other person, which is fine as a concept, but you get this system and method where, because people have got so much armour, they've got their padded gambesons, they've got fencing masks, they've got very sturdy gloves, which are like your hard plastic equivalents of medieval, full armour gauntlets, hard plastic greaves, padded sort of upper legs and things. They've got a lot of protection, and it changes the way people fight. We're looking at these treatises and that sort of information as if, as the information is showing pictures of people who aren't wearing armour, people who assume that if you get hit, it's going to cause something bad, really bad to happen. Maybe not as over dramatic as, like someone cuts your arm and it's going to get severed off like something stupid on TV. But certainly realistically, if you take a deep cut to your arm, it could do something to your muscles and tendons and things where maybe your arm doesn't function as well for the rest of your life. There are the risks of those sorts of grievous and life-altering injuries happening that you just don't want to take the risk. And a lot of the techniques, are trying to show this. For example, you don't see until later sort of sabre and stuff, people with their hands forward, because you're going to get your fingers cut, your arms cut and all sorts. So a lot of the medieval treatises show people with their weapons starting retracted. So here in Fiore's window, there's also similar with the German ox, down here in the boar's tooth, and the long tail, all these sorts of things, you'll notice whether the sword is high, low, whether it's on my dominant side, on my non-dominant side, whether I'm preparing for a thrust or a cut, you'll notice very overwhelmingly that people don't want to get hit so much that they'll actually have their ready positions, so they're able to do some sort of execute a manoeuvre to cut or thrust, but their first starting positions are very much keeping their body parts as much out of the way as possible. And yet, with, like I said, the way that they fight in things like HEMA, there's a lot of tendency for people to, there've been videos about the problem with HEMA. Here's the real problem with HEMA, where people have this decision where they want to maybe cut someone's head, and then they'll do it despite sacrificing their defence, and then they'll often get struck in the leg, in the arm, or areas like that, and certain rule systems will say, oh well, here's a hit to a limb, that's okay, but here's a hit to the head, and that scores more points. Well done, you're winning. Which is very contrary to the idea of not wearing armour. So hence, going back to things like the Holmgang, I saw that sort of difference in the fact that if you do get hit, because you're not wearing armour in a lot of those parts, even though you're using steel, proper weight weapons, they don't want to get hit because it hurts a lot and could very well cause injuries, and apparently they sometimes do end up with injuries that, are going to hospitalise them or need stitches and whatnot, and it changes the way they fight. But when you introduce the armour, I've noticed, I saw this moment, in fact, two engagements, with sort of, sword and shield, and they were wearing helmets, fighting around, parrying, doing this single time defence, so I block your sword, I swing at the same time, and all of this back and forth, and using the shields to control each other, and then, getting your cuts and thrusts in while you're doing that, and all that kind of stuff. But in the meantime, I was noticing that, as opposed to, like for example, I've done Scottish broadsword and things like that, they didn't really have the shields as high up. They are usually focusing on, either they'd have the shields up to sort of, do something like a shield bash to push into the opponent's shield and control them, or, otherwise cover to stop movement. Or otherwise they lower the shields. And this is because they're wearing helmets. Now, when I first saw this, my immediate, and I'd say maybe wrong reaction was thinking, that's not very historically accurate. Thinking, okay, so these people are just lowering their shields, and because they're wearing these helmets, they're sort of ignoring the fact that their head can get hit. They're just covering bits like their torso and their legs instead. And I initially thought, okay, well, you're exposing your head, it's going to get cut wide open. Realistically, you're not gonna, you wouldn't want to do that in a real fight. But then I thought, historically, if you look at people like the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings and those sorts of people, again, this is why I've got this set, it could actually work realistically, having that very same attitude, and it could be very historically accurate instead. So let's say I'm some sort of person in a village, I'm expected to bear arms and defend the area or go off and, attack the raiders. Let's say it's 1066 and we're off to fight the Vikings before we have to go down south and die by the Normans. Spoiler alert. So, I've got to be armed. Being that sort of villager, I'd probably have a shield, I'd have a spear, and if I've got a good bit of wealth, I'll have a sword, and I may well have, a shirt of mail, as well as a helmet. Now, if I'm not rich enough, then we lose the sword, and maybe I'll have some sort of knife or something by my side, and I'll also have to lose the shirt of mail. So I'm going for the bare minimum, what I can afford to make sure I don't die horribly. Got a spear, a shield, knife by my side in case things get really close up, and a helmet. And that would be interesting because then, if I'm fighting with a helmet, and of course padding underneath to make sure that it's going to take the cuts and punctures by deflecting, and also having some padding to absorb the force and make sure I don't get any concussions and things, then actually that sort of fighting style could work. So I'm using my shield, and maybe I'll duck my head a bit. As you can see, here's what will be the brim of the helmet. If I'm like this, I can look over my shield and I can keep it quite tight. But rather than doing something that I usually do in sparring, which is more like this, I'm raising the shield up to defend my head. I've got the sword retracted so I'm not getting my arms cut off, but it's there braced in some sort of position like here or here, do some sort of thrust or some sort of cut. But instead, if I've got a helmet that stops me from dying, I could maybe deliberately expose it. I could maybe have it low enough so I can see over the shield of my eyes. And even if someone tries to cut or thrust over into my eyes, it's an incredibly tiny distance. Within a picosecond I can just react and I've got my eyes covered again. But yet, with that exposed, now I can focus on protecting my torso and then areas like my legs. Now, from what I've seen in things like the Scottish broadsword treatises, you can usually protect your legs just by, you can't see it off camera, but basically you close up, you put your legs together, whatever leg was forward, your left leg or your right leg, however you've done it, you can just close it up, and then usually some sort of attack going for the legs will miss. So really for the shield, what I need to do is just protect my body. And then in terms of the parts that are vulnerable and I have to defend with my shield, there's not that much left, and it becomes a much easier job. If I've got my head, I've got a lot to defend. I've got to go all the way from my head, all the way down to my hips, and that's a lot more to defend. If my head is covered, and it's just armoured to the point where I don't have to worry about the opponent's attacks, now I've got a far shorter area that I need to defend, and this is wonderful. And again, like I said, that changes the fighting style. It means that because I'm wearing that armour, just something as simple as a helmet and nothing else at all as armour dramatically changes the way that you can and should fight. And it's worth bearing in mind that, when you're looking at things like the historical European martial arts that we do, there's a lot of tendency to be all or nothing, and people call it armoured and unarmoured fencing. So there's this idea where you either talk about, let's say, Fiore system of spear and pollacks and things like that, and then there's the assumption of armoured fencing. And that means you've got full plate armour, you've usually got some sort of mail covering the areas that are a bit more exposed, you're expecting to do things like hooking motions, manipulations in the joints, like for example there's one in a sort of half swording or poleaxe where you sort of hook it inside someone's elbow and then sort of bring it around bare them to the floor and you can smash their face open like that. or, you know, get down, open a visor, stab him in the face with your dagger, those sorts of things. And that's that assumption. All armour. You've got, you know, your helmet all the way down to your... Damn it, I've forgotten the names of them. The shoe parts, I don't care. I'll remember later on, I'll probably edit it. But, you know, full head-to-toe armour, and then you're assuming that, you know, your normal cuts and thrusts will do nothing because the parts are armoured. And then, on the complete opposite extreme, the unarmoured fencing, where the assumption is you have no protection whatsoever. Any hit that touches a part of your flesh is a danger that you shouldn't be making. You know, any cut on areas like your hands, that could disable your hands. A cut on your head, that could cause a severe bleeding injury that kills you. An area on your torso, you know, that could cause injury to your internal organs. All that sort of thing. So, you know, you've got these two extremes and then no room in between. Excuse me, when I next do sparring things, I might actually try experimenting, see if I can do some games where we maybe exclude certain targets. And I have tried this in the past, actually. I tried looking at having certain games because I noticed that people like me are very enthusiastic, as I call hand carvers, people who usually just go for the forearms and the hands because they're usually the most forward, you know, even if you're just doing some sort of parry or some sort of attack, usually that ends up further forward. You can just take cheap shots and try to cut them off. And it becomes a bit of a bad habit. But saying, you know, maybe for whatever reason, you know, in history or whatever, you could say the hands and the forearms are armoured. And I've tried this, so that saying any hit that happens to those areas, you ignore them. And then it changes the way that you fight. Initially I start with sort of the same old habits and I'm going, oh sorry, I'm targeting the hands and arms again. But then it sort of morphs gradually into better behaviour, focusing on doing things like proper parries and going out for areas like maybe grabbing a sword, cut at the head, or maybe some sort of parry riposte that closes distance rather than keeping out at range to just snipe at the hands. I'm actually closing in and trying a proper cut to areas like the head or the shoulders, lower torso, those sorts of things. And it's fascinating the way that doing that to change the, you know, pretending or even actually wearing certain forms of armour to protect certain areas, or again you could try the same thing with the head and say that the head no longer counts. If you've got something like shield fighting, that would dramatically change the way that the fight goes. Or maybe saying that you've got greaves and things, take the legs. You know, there are loads of options. But it's that idea of how certain arrangements of armour, where you have, you know, areas that are exposed as if they're unarmoured, and then other areas counting as so fully armoured you should basically ignore them, not only changes the way that people fight literally, like in the case of the Holmgang, where wearing actual helmets makes them hit, you know, makes them ignore themselves getting hit in the head and focus more on the other target. But even if you imagine it and you try to do some controlled sparring with those sorts of rule changes, you can force yourself to iron out kinks in technique. Like, for example, with myself, doing less of this thing I've perfected with chopping up people's fingers and forearms, and now going for the new areas, which are difficult, and it forces me to try these targets that I'm not experienced at fighting against. And I think to become, you know, if we were trying to talk about hypothetically this incredible, you know, incredibly skilled warrior, I think one of the things they should be able to do is adapt. So if you have a person like myself, I'd say I'm not great at fighting because I have this habit of just targeting those areas. What if I'm up against someone who is no longer vulnerable there? I run out of ideas. I need to learn to go for the areas that are exposed by whatever armour sets they're wearing, or perhaps whatever equipment sets they're wearing. Different weapons will change it as well. So that's enough rambling. That should hopefully give some thoughts for you guys, and hope to see you in the next video, and ta-ra for now. Have a good day.